Welcome to you both. Great to have you here.
Great to be back.
Thank you.
So, Irina, the Department of Energy estimates that data center energy demands will double or even triple in the next 3 years. So what are the climate impacts from AI and how are they expected to grow? What are we looking at here?
I think there are a lot of climate impacts of AI. I think we need to first talk about what the environmental impact is at the most basic level. I think most people don't know quite the level of energy required in order to power the data centers that help us with all the technology that we use. I think most people don't realize the amount of water, drinking water, that's required to cool those data centers. So aside from just the generative impact of AI, I'm sorry.
The stakes, what's really at stake? It's hard to get a grasp on how much energy these things use and what the environmental stakes are.
I think the environmental stakes are exactly what you would imagine from having massive energy consumption and massive water consumption, and the kind of growth that we're seeing, which is not really matched by the ability of the electric grid to keep up with it. It's not matched by sources of power, and even the biggest tech companies that are deploying this right now are saying that we're not quite ready in terms of being able to manage even its own growth, let alone the environmental impact from it. And the hope that's being presented is that AI itself will help find us solutions. But in the meantime, we're deploying it in a way that's not sustainable.
And we'll get to some of those benefits later. Kate, for my first question to you, I uploaded Google's 2024 sustainability report to Google's AI tool called Notebook, and I asked it what I should ask you. So here's what it generated. Given Google's ambitious goal to reach net zero emissions across all operations by 2030, and the nearly 50% increase in total GHG emissions the last 4 years, what are you going to do to reverse this trend and ensure that the achievement of this critical net zero target?
Yes. Well, first of all, I so appreciate your having me back here, and it's great to be with you, and such an important conversation for us to be having right now. And the way that we look at this topic as an innovation and an information company, an AI-first company, is that we really need to approach AI both boldly and responsibly. So I know we'll get into the conversation later, the applications that we see for AI to enable the energy transition, to enable us to really address climate change in meaningful ways. And then it's critically important that we're having this conversation around the footprint of AI. So when we look at our own operational footprint, as a global company, we're operating data centers around the world that are powering AI and all of our products. And we have a value chain that enables the hardware for those data centers as well as for our consumer hardware devices. So that footprint number that you're looking at is towards a very ambitious goal that we've set for ourselves for 2030, which is that we want to be net zero across that whole operations and value chain from a 2019 baseline. And as you can imagine, as a high growth business, our business looks quite different today than it did in 2019. So the way that we're getting after those reductions is predominantly around clean energy, both clean energy for Google, for our own operations, as well as supporting our value chain, our suppliers that are manufacturing semiconductors, hardware for data centers, hardware for cell phones and other devices to decarbonize their manufacturing processes. So that's the biggest lever for us. But then it's also low carbon building materials for data centers. It's the utilization of sustainable aviation fuels. And then after we do all of that work to reduce our footprint, we're also going to purchase carbon removals that will actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. So it's an ambitious goal. We have a lot of work left to do, but we also have a strategy. And we think that strategy is important not only for us to reduce our own footprint, but to be early adopters of things like geothermal power, advanced nuclear power, carbon removal solutions that will have the ability to scale and reduce emissions in a wider economy way.
Because broadly speaking, within tech, there's real concern that Microsoft was going to erase emissions from the history of the company. Google, I think, has been early on this from the early days of renewable energy, less cheaper than coal, a long time. But the energy demands of AI are really putting at risk a lot of big tech's sustainability pledges and promises because it's juicing profits, because it's such a big innovation. There's the China threat. If we don't do it, China will. And it's juicing profits. There's the China threat. And the resource needs are enormous. And so is it fair to say that AI is really threatening sustainability pledges and goals?
We remain absolutely committed to our goals, and I think it's good to level set a bit on where are we today, and then where are the various projections that we're looking at. As you can imagine, I'm looking at this very closely, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more in the conversation. So if you look at all global data centers today, so that's powering AI and everything else that data centers operate, it's about 1% of global electricity use, between 5 to 15% of overall economic output. So a pretty efficient use of electricity per economic output. Now, if you look at a lot of studies that have come out recently, in the US, for example, one of the more recent studies pointed to by 2035, data centers would represent about 20 to 25% of load growth in the US. That's about half of what we would see from electric vehicles. So absolutely, AI load growth is a critical topic. It's absolutely important that we're looking at how do we make model training more efficient, how do we make AI hardware more efficient, and then how do we bring more carbon-free energy, more clean, firm power onto grids to power that load. And it's important to look at AI in the larger context of load growth, which is also about electrification of vehicles, of buildings, of manufacturing, which is actually a really good thing. That's creating jobs, that's creating prosperity, that's creating competitiveness here in the US and in other markets as well. So we look at it in that broader context, and then we drive very specifically at how we reduce that footprint across those three dimensions that I mentioned.
So let's pick about that jobs and location, because these are massive.
Can I jump in for one second
Irina.
in terms of the energy uses? Because the computing power required to power all of this is doubling between 100 days and 6 months. This is what we're talking about. I mean, we're talking massive, very rapid growth. And that's mostly for the training of models. In terms of inference, which is the actual processing every time you run one of the generative AI, for example, Google itself has said that the energy required is going to grow by orders of magnitude. So it's not just that it's growing at such a rapid pace that we are not able to keep up with it. And Gartner Research came out in November with a study that said that AI data centers are going to be restricted in terms of their power by 2027. So that's in 2 years. We're not only running into long-term issues, but short-term issues where even the data centers themselves won't have the power required. So I think a conversation about why we're putting AI into everything so quickly is part of what's needed here.
Yeah, even I think Sam Altman has commented like the amount of energy needed is kind of mind blowing to do this stuff. So, Kate, are we?
Well, let's get into it, because I think there's a lot of really specific work that we're doing, and of course that you're seeing across the industry. But I think where we're seeing a lot of progress is on efficient model training. So as you noted, that's a really important area. We've published a paper because we're really also passionate about how can we share as many of the best practices that we're utilizing ourselves with others in this sector. So we published an academic journal article not long ago that looked at ways that we're reducing the energy requirements for AI by 100x, the emissions by up to 1,000x through specific techniques and how we can more efficiently do our training. When you also look at AI hardware, each generation, the hardware is getting significantly more efficient. So our custom AI chips are called TPUs, tensor processing units. From one generation, from the 5th generation to the 6th generation alone, they got 67% more efficient. And again, I think what you're seeing here, as we've seen in the data center industry for many years, is strong alignment between the business outcome, which is to do the work more efficiently, and the environmental outcome. And you may know John Koomey, who's a professor at Stanford, who's been very preeminent in the space. He looked at this period of time from 2010 to 2018, when the internet was growing significantly, when data centers were growing significantly. In that time, capacity increased by 550% and electricity only by 6%. Now, I'm not saying I predict that to be the same case here, but it's just good to look at this as a sector where the environmental reductions and efficiency is actually quite business aligned. So this is a sector that has done that in other times of growth and will continue to drive on it. And then it's about the carbon-free energy. And as you point out, there's a lot of conversation right now around capacity. One thing I would point out is the best thing we can do for ourselves in the near term is better utilize the electricity we already have on the grid. That is going to be our most near-term solution. We've done a lot of work at Google to look at how can we do load shifting in both time and space, so to times of day when the grid is cleaner or to locations where there's more capacity.
So train the models at night when there's a lot of electricity, or during the day when there's excess solar and California is actually exporting it to other states.
Indeed, so looking at that flexibility, and again for us, although AI is a growing part of our data center workloads, there's a lot of work happening in our data centers around storage, around photos, around other activities that can be delayed by some period of time. Some of the work has to be done immediately, some of it doesn't. So again, it's looking at how do we more effectively use the electrons we have, and then how do we use this to continue to drive a renaissance of clean, firm energy. You know, we signed a first-of-a-kind agreement with Fervo, who I know you know, which is an advanced geothermal company, getting a first-of-a-kind advanced geothermal power plant online in Nevada to power some of our operations there. We signed a first-of-a-kind power purchase agreement with Kairos Power for 500 megawatts of new, clean, firm power, looking to 2030 and beyond. So again, I think this is also an opportunity to get more clean, firm energy resources onto the grid in this moment of load growth. So there's certainly a lot of challenge in front of us, but I think we're seeing how we're going to work towards this.
And by
as a
firm,
sector.
you mean like reliable, not intermittent, like the wind and solar. But if Google has a choice between signing a data center where energy is clean or it's cheap, cheap wins, right?
So we have a commitment that by 2030, we want to power all of our operations across the globe on 24/7 carbon-free energy. We're 64% of the way there, in spite of continuing to really grow significantly as a business. We have multiple sites that are already up at 90%. And so that is something that is a moonshot. We like to say we like hard problems at Google. This is a very challenging aspiration that we've set for ourselves, but it enables us to really push on thinking about where we're siting, also working with our utilities. So we pioneered with NV Energy, which is the utility in Nevada, a model called a clean transition tariff or clean transition rate, which allows us to work directly with the utility on what is our load profile going to look like so they can deliver clean power for us as our load profile grows. So I think there's a lot of tools that we have in the toolbox, and because we're in this moment of growth and because we have this bold aspiration, it pushes us to innovate, it pushes us to get creative. And of course, that's good for the whole sector because we want to be driving towards these solutions that can scale and be cost effective for everyone.
You worked in the federal government under the Obama administration. The Biden administration had a focus on looking at overburdened communities where a lot of industrial facilities are placed. So how does Google consider environmental justice when citing data centers?
So we have also really been looking at how can we use our demand to support local communities. And so we've innovated a few different models that we are looking at how we can scale further of how can we support low and medium income households in doing weatherization or in community solar. And so we've been piloting different solutions that we see could really hopefully scale. There's this idea of having RACs that are renewable energy certificates that are associated with these particular kind of projects. So this is a space we're really passionate about. We've done some good piloting, and I think there's an opportunity for us to make this part of this movement around how do we deliver more clean load, even in a distributed way too, to my point around how can we get as much out of what's already on the grid, and then how can we get creative. So this is an area we're really interested in and we're working on.
So there's a lot of research in making AI greener, and you're right that it's aligned with business incentives in some ways. But to your broader question about whether we're smart enough to answer this, I think we're smart enough. I don't think we're committed enough, because the level of financing that goes into deploying AI right now is not matched by the kinds of projects that companies are doing with vulnerable communities or with replenishing water. It's at a different scale. And you see researchers like, I've been meaning to express my gratitude to Dr. Sasha Lucioni and Xiaolei Ren and Emma Strubel, who've talked about the need to educate the public and lawmakers and everybody about the energy impact and about the water needs. Because the companies are not right now stepping up enough to counter these effects.
Yeah, well, I think certainly
there are a lot of pilot programs. There are a lot of very interesting projects, but not nearly at the scale at which we're seeing the need.
Right. Well, I mean, but that's Irina. You're the ethicist of markets are amoral, right? And their primary function of publicly listed companies are to generate profits and return capital to shareholders. There is a social license to operate, so companies have to have that. Think about tobacco companies selling cancer sticks. That was dented, but really, isn't it foolish to expect companies whose primary purpose is to generate profits to do anything other than maximize those profits?
Right. We shouldn't rely on them. We should rely on lawmakers to put the brakes on some of these efforts. We should rely on consumers being educated so they can actually make choices about what products they want to use and what they don't. And right now, without more disclosure for the companies, it's hard to make any ethical decisions, right? You can't balance the benefits versus harms if you don't know what the harms are. And most people are still really surprised when they hear the kind of numbers that we're talking about here. It hasn't seeped into the general consciousness. And often lawmakers are enticed to bring in data centers into their areas because they bring certain benefits with them. And again, the whole discussion that needs to happen around the environmental impact has followed very late compared to all of the promises and the hype that came first.
Well, I mean, AI, until ChatGPT, most people in 2022, kind of thought AI was this futuristic thing. It exploded pretty quickly. Let's pick up, Kate, on disclosure. Several bills were introduced in the California legislature this year, calling for companies operating large data centers to disclose how much energy they use and protect ratepayers from cost increases caused by these giant facilities. There is concern that this demand is pushing costs onto an average person. So where do you stand on disclosure and protecting average citizens from price pressure on their utility bills?
Yeah, indeed. I think disclosure is absolutely the baseline for any corporate sustainability program. We've been reporting our corporate greenhouse gas footprint for 19 years to the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. We've published a very detailed environmental report for the last 10 years. We'll be publishing our 10th one this summer. And that's where we detail our overall emissions, how we're doing towards our goals on carbon-free energy, our water replenishment program. We haven't gotten into water yet. We have a goal to replenish 120% of the water we consume. We actually just shared our progress on that over the weekend for World Water Day. So absolutely, disclosure is essential. And this is where we both...
Is it facility specific that this data center uses that much? Because sometimes they're like, oh, that's proprietary. Is it facility specific?
It depends on the topic. We have a global carbon inventory that we publish. We also publish our global water use, waste data, et cetera. And then in certain instances, we will, for instance, show you for each cloud region what is our progress towards our carbon-free energy goal. For water, we have disclosure at a site level. In some cases, we do run into proprietary challenges, but absolutely, the direction of travel is to become more granular. Every year, we become more granular. Every year, we're improving the quality of our data. Actually, this is a great use case for AI. You mentioned that you asked our report this question. We're also seeing tremendous opportunities for companies to become much more efficient and granular in their reporting through AI because it makes it much more efficient to do the collection of data, to get all your suppliers to report your data. So absolutely, disclosure is essential. And it's also how we share. It's how we share what's working, what's not working for the practitioners in the space. I read many different sustainability reports myself because it really helps us see how do we continue to improve. And then to your point on ratepayers, very important. That actually comes back to what we were discussing a moment ago on this clean transition tariff model. This allows large energy users to plan directly with their utilities for their energy use and for the carbon-free energy that they would like to see, which is then allowing to remove the burden from the ratepayer for the large energy user to plan directly with their utilities. So we really see this as an important model to take on board in many other places.
Right, because there's already lots of pressure on utility prices, which is a bad thing if we need to electrify everything to address the climate crisis. You mentioned water. Irina, water is used to cool data centers. Most people have never been inside one, but they're just massive, called farms, racks of huge servers creating lots of heat that needs to be cooled. And could you explain the water requirements and potential conflicts with local communities, especially in water-stressed regions?
Can I back up a little bit and talk about disclosure just for one more second? We ended up talking about two different things. One is about a legally required disclosure, and one is voluntary disclosures. So I think we are now at a point where we probably should not be relying just on voluntary disclosures, even if they're very well intended and even if they're pretty detailed. The kind of bills you were talking about are in response to the fact that a lot of companies have not been disclosing at a granular enough level. In terms of the water usage, one issue that's interesting is that often the balance between the energy requirement and the water requirement works at odds with itself. So you might need to cool with more water when it would actually be more energy efficient to put a data center. I'm not doing a good job explaining this, but there are places that are very water strained, and the data centers are still ending up in those places. And we're finding that the research is not helping us figure out how to not do that. And this is to your point about the vulnerable communities. Often the communities right around data centers are the ones that suffer the most, and especially in places where there's water scarcity. And there are still data centers, and again, I really appreciate the report that Google puts out because I've read it as well. And
I didn't read it. I just asked the AI.
I did read it, and it makes some.
You're a better human than I. So.
It makes some excellent points about all of the things that Google is doing, but it also points out that even in 2023, which is the last year that is covered by the 24 report, 15% of the water usage came from water scarcity areas. Yeah. And the global greenhouse gases emissions increased, and the energy requirements increased. So even as all this work is happening that we are talking about, the environmental impact so far is only growing. And I don't mean at all to pick on Google. Google is one example, but there are many companies all in the same boat, all of which are using more energy and more water for their data centers.
So Kate, your company, Google, has faced pushback over water usage in drought-prone areas like Arizona, South Carolina, and Oregon. So how do you address it? I know you've made this pledge to replenish, but you're only 1/6 of the way there.
We just shared more progress over the weekend, actually, that I can tell you
Okay,
about.
so you're more than 18% there. So.
Yeah, indeed. And I really appreciate the nuances that you're raising around what we think of as climate conscious cooling. So there is a trade-off between energy efficiency and the use of water-based cooling. And so in every site that we go to, we look at that trade-off. And so sometimes the option is to find non-potable water sources. We use gray water, seawater, canal water, a whole variety of non-potable water sources at data centers around the world. We also have data centers that don't use water-based cooling, where we just decide to make that trade-off to take a small hit on energy consumption because it doesn't make sense to use water in that location. So that's how we're approaching it on a site-specific basis, because as we know, in some places water is plentiful and this isn't an issue. In some places, as you point out, water is stressed, and then we need to take a different approach. So that's kind of the first order work that we do. And then beyond that, we've said we want to replenish 120% of the water that we consume by 2030. And for World Water Day on Saturday, we shared we've now been able to replenish 4.5 billion gallons of water through projects around the world. A lot of the more recent ones that we shared updates on are around agriculture. How do we support farmers from California to France to Chile in different irrigation practices? We've also done a lot of work around nature-based nature-based solutions. As we know, nature-based solutions enable us to better recharge groundwater, to replenish water that's been depleted. So we're doing these projects globally. That 4.5 billion gallons is compared to the 6.1 billion gallons that we used in 2023. So we're making progress. We need to keep scaling towards that 120% replenishment.
But as of 2023, you're only replenished 18%. So where are you now of these updated numbers?
I can't do the math of the 4.5 to 6.1,
Okay, so
but we'll
it's a
share
big-
the full report. But this
Okay,
we
but
wanted
you-
to share some progress for World Water
Got a
Day.
long ways to go to get to 120%
Indeed, yeah.
in 7 years.
Not just that, but the kind of deployment that we've seen since 2023, right? 2024 was a year with a lot of deployment of AI in all kinds of contexts. So the situation might be very different, again, even with the best efforts. And I feel like we're doing a little bit of a disservice by talking about AI broadly as if it's one thing. Because, first of all, we need AI to even assess climate impact, to crunch all the vast data sets and to understand what's happening. So AI is extremely important in the climate fight. But different kinds of AI have different environmental footprints. And generative AI, which is the hot stuff that everybody's been talking about since ChatGPT came out, is the one that has by far the biggest environmental impact and the biggest demands. And those models that are being deployed are growing in size, and they're being deployed, again, at a massive scale, where we're talking about hundreds of millions of users playing with these right now free tools often, and having some that they're paying for. There are platforms like Hugging Face that announced that they're hosting 1.5 million models. So this is the kind of scale and growth that we're talking about. And even within generative AI, the impact of producing images, for example, is very different than the impact from producing text. And there's been research that says producing 1 or 2 AI-generated images takes up the equivalent of charging your phone, that having 10 to 50, back and forth conversation, prompt conversation with a chatbot is the equivalent of using half a liter of drinking water. So if you think about that level and having hundreds of millions of people playing with these tools without realizing that they're spilling water on the ground or just using energy at the level that they are, that's the challenge here. And this is why now that we're talking more, because of laws coming up in Europe, about things like AI literacy, we need AI literacy, and we need AI literacy to include a conversation about the environmental impact. That's something I haven't seen yet. Even when we talk about ethical issues around AI, you often hear about bias, you hear about copyright issues and challenges, and other things, and privacy and all the concerns. But often the environmental impact is still flying under the radar.
Right. I mean, it is getting through. I mean, I was looking at I used ChatGPT on my phone the other day, and my daughter looked at me, 20-year-old college kid, said, "You know that uses lots of water, don't you?" Like, I got the shame look. So it's getting through to somebody on TikTok. But to disclosure, Kate, Google, that's a good point, because every time we send an email, there's like a puff of energy somewhere that. Right? Something, maybe there's some solar, depending on where you live, there's a little bit of coal burned. What opportunity, with the power that Google has, to educate people of like, yeah, that little cool thing I did, what was the energy impact of it, right? It seems like there's a tremendous opportunity, perhaps responsibility for Google, to pair awareness with these cool new tools. So when we're like, oh gosh, I didn't know that I just burned a liter of drinking water with my little, I wonder what ChatGPT will say for this.
Yeah, and I think there's certainly opportunity there. I think what we've really focused on communicating is around carbon-free energy, because that's such a critical component of how do we make these tools as sustainable as possible. So that's where we've really focused on sharing that story, both from a transparency perspective, but also because it enables us to see where we have a lot more work to do. So for instance, if you look at, we publish a chart every year in our environmental report on how are we doing in each place where we operate. In Asia, in the Asia Pacific region, we're not doing that great because it's really hard to get access to carbon-free energy. We use that as a tool to then go talk with policymakers to create that transparency about what's the work we have left to do. These are opportunities and challenges for us, and also for us to go advocate to get more of that clean electricity online. As it
But
relates,
the real power is at the point of, like, I don't use Google search, but I went to it the other day preparing for this,
Yeah.
and it's like, oh, the sustainability thing is at the bottom.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's at the
Yeah.
point of use, the disclosure is there, because other than, most people are not going to, as important that is, read the sustainability report at that consumer-facing point of use, like, oh, I never thought about. Okay, there it is. I can think about that.
Yeah, indeed. I think this is something that we're having a conversation around, and it is tremendously challenging because as you look at how a data center functions, it's operating many different tools and products and services. So sort of aggregating and segregating out exactly that number is more challenging than you think. But it's absolutely something we're working on, and I think it's something that would be interesting to share more around.
So let's talk. We mentioned, but I want to come back to kind of the positive impacts of AI. Thank you, Irina. Is not one thing.
Yeah.
There's many different kinds, and training models is where the real energy is used. Kate, what are some areas where AI can be used to deforestation, traffic routing,
Absolutely.
et cetera? There's some very powerful tools.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it's making the climate crisis worse. On the other hand, it can help us address it.
Yes, and we see a huge opportunity for this, so much so that we've set an aspiration for ourselves that we want to enable businesses, policymakers, individuals to avoid a gigaton of emissions by 2030 through AI in all of our platforms. That's like the emissions of Japan.
Thank you, because I don't know. Yeah.
Yes,
I don't know
indeed.
what that means.
So that's a very ambitious aspiration. And so we've really gone deep on particularly energy as a sector and transportation as a sector, where we need to see decarbonization and where AI can be a really useful tool. So for instance, we were talking about this backstage, but we have Google Maps. Some of you may have used Google Maps to get here this evening. There is a little green leaf icon in Google Maps. That is showing you the most fuel efficient route, which we've calculated in the background using AI to understand traffic patterns, the grading of roads, and a variety of other factors. That's already enabled our users to avoid 2.9 million metric tons of CO2e. That's like taking 650,000 vehicles off the road. We've also been working with cities to help them better sequence their traffic lights. This is really powerful because it reduces starting and stopping events. And when a car is idling at an intersection, it's 69x the emissions of when it's on the open road. So we're able to reduce those starting and stopping events by 30% and emissions by 10%, just by working with cities to do better sequencing of their traffic lights. We've also been working with aviation, commercial aviation. We talk about this as a very hard to abate sector. It represents about 3% of global emissions. Well, a third of that 3%, according to the IPCC, is from contrails, those plumes that you see behind jets. We have been working with American Airlines and Breakthrough Energy to use AI to better understand why are they forming. It turns out it's about time of day and temperature and altitude, and then to work with pilots to make small adjustments in their altitude to reduce those contrails. We've already shown that you can do that by more than half, by 54% in these 77 test flights that we ran with American. So these are the kinds of solutions that we're seeing that can be extremely powerful, that can drive emissions reductions across these hard-to-abate sectors, and much more to come. We're looking at agriculture and nature-based solutions. It's going to be a really powerful tool. You mentioned the foundational science, climate modeling, also a very powerful application for AI.
So many potential uses of this, Irina, and yet it's hard. I have a hard time measuring all
well, let me
those.
jump in because those are all very powerful and wonderful uses. But I think that's when you get the critics asking or saying that we're boiling the oceans in order to summarize emails, right? That's a very different kind of generative AI than the kind of uses that we were just talking about. So. Do we need all the chatbot interfaces in every aspect of our lives right now? That's the kind of thing that uses a lot of energy and potentially with a lot less return value.
So is there an ethical framework for, if there's one view is like sort of voluntary companies going to do what's profitable for them? Is there an ethical framework you think society ought to be using to evaluate all these competing goods and bads?
I don't think we can have a society-wide ethical framework. I think this is a conversation that needs to be much more contextual, and it depends on the particular kind of industry and the particular kind of AI used, and the location. There are just too many factors to apply one framework. But what I will say is that we as the non-scientists and non-business people, to have choices. And in order to make ethical choices, we need the information in the first place. And to your point, I mean, to be fair, I don't mean, again, to put it just on Google. I think all of these companies have a role to play where they could actually provide a lot more information so that people can, apply their own ethical framework depending on, their own values and the choices that they're making. And so we don't have enough information to do that, and we don't have enough choice at the design level. For example, right now, if you want to do a Google search, you can't choose, as far as I know, to turn off the AI overviews. I think that would be a really interesting place to allow people to make choices. If they feel that that's something that they value and that they prefer, they should be able to use it. But right now, there are these deployments at scale on all of us where we don't really get to have that kind of input.
Right. It seems like Google gives us lots of tools you can turn off tracking to some extent, et cetera. So what about that? I don't want to use AI because I have some issues with that. I know maybe search is not your domain, but sustainability is. Is that an option to I'd like to use Google products but not use AI because I'm concerned about energy and water?
Indeed, you're right. I am the Chief Sustainability Officer, so I get to think about how do we use that AI to avoid a gigaton of emissions. That's my area.
You don't get to tell the search people what to do. So Irina, you mentioned individual companies would have their own frameworks, but the internet is minimally regulated. Pharmaceutical company needs all sorts of approvals before they put a product on the market. Tech companies do not. They can roll out social media tools that damage girls' brains, and then we have to kind of play catch up. Now comes along AI, moving very fast. Policy leaders don't understand it. The public doesn't understand it. It's moving like wicked fast, even for Silicon Valley standards fast. So will voluntary, action, restraint be sufficient by these individual companies who are all competing against each other? Well, if we don't do it, they're going to do it. And if Americans don't do it, China's going to do it. So let's do it.
Right. No, I don't think it will be sufficient. I think we need lawmakers, and again, I think we need lawmakers who themselves are better informed.
Right now, they're pretty clueless.
Well, I mean, I think it's a difficult, it's a new technology, and then they're supposed to know everything about everything. So what I would say is that I think lawmakers need to assign staff people who will keep track specifically of AI-related issues because it's that important right now. I think there needs to be a lot more education, and I think lawmakers have an opportunity to engage with academics in their own areas, in their own states, and in their own, cities, who have very different incentives than the business folks do. Right now, the business technologists are the ones who are being heard, but there are a lot of AI researchers who are working in academia who could be, fountains of information for lawmakers who are looking to draft better laws. And I do think we need some laws. And I think, whether I think so or not, they're coming. And they're coming at the state level. And they're coming pretty fast. And not just from California, but from many different states. So companies are going to have to comply with some new laws in the near future.
So what would constitute a meaningful corporate accountability structure? If you were to say, this is what we need, quickly, what would you be able to draw for?
That's not my area.
Kate, how do you, Google did join Coca-Cola, Exxon, Walmart, and other companies that cut ties with American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, that works to loosen environmental protections. Yet Google remains associated with the National Association of Manufacturers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who've worked pretty hard to slow down the transition to clean energy. So I know the lobbyists and lawyers don't report to you. These corporations are like countries, they're large, but you're the green person inside advocating for this. So how do you explain all the sustainability goals that you espouse? And this is the rap against Silicon Valley in general. Talk green, do green, but the lobbyists in Washington play a different game.
So you're correct for organizations like the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, We remain members alongside many other large corporations, and there we have been founding members of their climate task forces. And our philosophy has really been good to have a seat at that table on many issues, including this one. In terms of the chamber and the BRT, we've seen, I think, progress on their climate policies. We'll see
little baby steps.
Yeah, we'll see how things evolve from here. But that's the philosophy that we've taken. Either we can walk away and not have a seat at that table, or we can be in the room trying to influence from a seat of being a member. And so that's where we are.
So better to be there than not there. Google's also invested in carbon offsets, kind of a murky area. Some people think that they're a scam. I buy them sometimes. I kind of hold my nose. They're better than nothing, but not fully what they proclaim. So, are they simply, what's your position on offsets? Because they're very controversial and complicated.
So today where we are is we talked a while ago about our net zero goal, that we have this ambition to reduce our footprint 50% from 2019, and then to manage the rest with both nature-based and technology-based carbon removals. So this is a particular form of carbon credit that's about actually removing carbon from the atmosphere, which the IPCC tells us we need to do both. To stay on some trajectory towards the Paris Agreement, we need to do both. We need to both dramatically reduce emissions and remove carbon from the atmosphere. So we see it as being a positive thing for us to be early investors in that space, to be sending a demand signal, because these technologies have to be developed for the science. So for instance, we've done work around advanced rock weathering. We signed an agreement at the end of last year with a company called Teradot. Advanced rock weathering is using basalt to put into soil to more quickly absorb carbon. It's a natural process that would occur much more slowly, but you can add it to soil to enable more carbon to be removed from the atmosphere. We've also looked at similar strategies that can be done in water to make streams and freshwater more carbon absorbing. We've looked at reforestation projects. We've also done work around direct air capture and using direct air capture to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So it's going to take a portfolio approach. This is a fairly new area. And what we see is that we can be an early adopter. We've come together with companies around what's called an advanced market commitment. This was first pioneered in the biotechnology world for drug development. We've now joined advanced market commitments called Frontier, as well as Symbiosis, which are focused on either 1,000-year permanence, so more technology-oriented removals, or more nature-based removals, to really try to advance the science and bring these technologies forward more quickly. So we think it's an important part of the work, and the science really backs that up.
Irina, some people would say that direct capture, these sorts of technologies Kate just mentioned, create a moral hazard because they can allow us to keep burning fossil fuels. It sort of enables this status quo to continue. Like it's kind of like a little bit like putting a filter on a cigarette. We can keep smoking, we'll just put a filter on it.
But they don't even do that, because with all of the efforts that we're talking about, again, we're seeing greenhouse gas emissions increasing year over year. We're seeing, water being used more and more. We're seeing the demand for electricity going up, again, doubling every 100 days just to train the models. And then the inference cost is actually much higher. The World Economic Forum, at least one article, estimated that about 20% of the energy use goes to training models and 80% goes to inference, to just the fact that we're all playing with these tools all
Inferences
the time.
means we're using them.
Yes, exactly. Generating an image, putting in a prompt and getting some response, all of those are called inferences. So, at this scale, even, you're talking about sort of greenwashing, but even the greenwashing is not keeping up, if that's what it is. And I think there's, again, these are very real efforts, and I think we should embrace all of them and encourage all of the companies to keep doing them. But I think we have to talk at some point about slowing down the deployment and allowing people to make more choices and figuring out where this really belongs and where the energy use and the water use is worth it and where it's not.
I mean, that was called for at one point, that there was sort of like, hey, let's have a pause, because there's some fear that like, hey, this thing's getting away from us.
That was more of a pause in research, and I think that's a whole conversation, because you were talking about the arms race and the fear that China will get something first, and I think you can still do the research and answer those concerns and be at the forefront. That doesn't mean you have to deploy these in every school and in every business and in every context, right? Those are two separate conversations.
Okay, so Irina, everything you've heard Kate say this evening, what did you hear that you most agree with? Where's their common ground?
I agree that there's a lot of opportunity, and I think that the companies are trying to take it. But I think, again, the level of investment that we see in deploying these tools is not being matched by the level of investment and the kind of efforts that Kate is talking about. And I think that's what we should be demanding. There should be an equal number of dollars going into green energy and all of the things that she mentioned.
Kate, where did you, of other things that Irina mentioned, what do you have most common ground, most agree with?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I mentioned at the outset, we as a company are really committed to developing our AI in a both bold and responsible way. And I think all the issues you're raising are very near and dear to my heart and to our heart. How do we make AI as efficient as possible, both from a training and a hardware perspective? How do we bring as much carbon-free energy online as possible? Have a thoughtful approach to water that evaluates water stress, the trade-off between water and energy, replenishes the water that we need to consume. Working with academics, I really appreciate what you were saying about policymakers and frankly companies. We do a lot of work with academic institutions because you all are at the forefront of helping us think through this. So I really value the work that you're doing, that academics are doing to help us think through this, and again, to be as bold and responsible as possible.
Well, we're going to go to audience questions.
Can I throw in
Sure.
one more thing? That it's also almost too broad to talk about companies as if they're unitary things. And within all of the tech companies, there are a lot of people who care really deeply about this stuff and are trying to shift the conversation. But the business imperative is pretty strong, to your point. So the question is also, how do we really partner with those people and recognize that, all of the folks who work in tech are regular citizens living in this environment as well. And if, the climate apocalypse is coming for the data centers too. So we need to figure out how to really partner more effectively to prevent that.
Right, we're sort of in this system, and this capitalism that we have right now has not been the capitalism we've always had. There's very prosperous eras of American capitalism that were not so fixated on shareholder primacy. There was a whole era before Milton Friedman. So this is not, the kind of capitalism now is not the only kind of capitalism we can have. This has been such an engaging conversation. We have some questions. I'd like to invite Matt, Noel, Leela, and Nina to the microphone over here in that order. So Matt, Noel, Leela, and Nina to... Welcome, Matt.
Thank you. My name is Matt Rudolph, the CEO of STS Global Services. I had a question for Ms. Brandt. You mentioned that Google discloses its water use and carbon emissions, among other impacts. Are those disclosures verified by an independent verification body to ensure credibility of the claims?
Yes, thank you for the question. Indeed. So we have our carbon footprint validated by our auditor from Ernst Young, as well as several of the other metrics that we include in the report, and we're constantly working to bring more factors into that third-party validation. As you may be familiar, this has been voluntary until now. You were talking about the difference between voluntary and regulated. The CSRD regulations in Europe were going to require this in their recent omnibus. They've actually backed off of that, but we will continue to do that. We think it's critical. We're working to bring in a full validation of our Scope 3. We're doing a mock of that this year. So absolutely, we think the third-party validation really helps. It makes us better, and it adds credibility to the disclosure that we're doing on a voluntary basis.
We've also been monitoring, it was unfortunate what happened with the omnibus bill, or at least what appears to be happening with the omnibus bill.
Indeed, not totally done.
Do you see an alignment of the different regulatory frameworks between what was going to be the SEC bill and what we have here in California and what was CSRD in Europe and other regulatory disclosure frameworks? Do you see those eventually aligning in one particular area?
We would love to see that. I mean, this has been one of our positions. We're very favorable on disclosure, and it would be extremely valuable to see convergence. So ISSB, I think, ideally is playing that role of sort of creating a more global standard. My team does all of our reporting and has done for many, many years. It's much better for us and creates a more consistent approach for disclosure if we can see that convergence. So I think it remains to be seen, but that's certainly something we're in favor of.
Oh,
Thank you very much. This has been a fantastic and informative conversation. Thank you, Greg and Kate and Irina. Kate, my question is for you. You spoke of many good efforts that Google is making with regard to the environment, and I wanted to ask about what's happening in Washington and in Sacramento. I think either Irina or Greg alluded to different bills, but where is Google coming out on these bills that we know nothing about? Is Google supporting efforts that would match what you're talking about tonight?
Yes, indeed. I think disclosure is one area where there's been a lot of regulatory movement. So we've shared basically exactly what I just shared in response to the previous question. We've been very much in favor of regulatory reform to enable permitting and interconnection to be unlocked so we can get more carbon-free energy onto grids. We've published extensive policy white papers on what we think that could look like, also on how partnerships with utilities can be better facilitated, like I was talking about that clean transition tariff. And we engage on other topics as well. In Europe, we've been very engaged on the clean industrial deal, on policy there. So absolutely, I'm a former policymaker myself. I spent almost a decade in Washington. So it's absolutely important that we do share what we see as the policy unlocks to driving the kind of progress we want to see in the world.
So it sounds like you would, like what Irina is talking about, that is what Google is, those are the types of policies that Google is supporting in Washington and Sacramento and other areas.
Yeah, I mean, we try to be really specific around what do we see as the specific policy interventions, like, you know, how do we do permitting reforms smartly so that we can get more clean energy onto the grid? How can we set up regulatory regimes so that we can work with utilities as a large energy user to take burden off ratepayers and get more carbon-free energy onto grid? So we try to be really specific, and we actually have published a lot of white papers on this on our website that you can find, sustainability.google. But that's really the approach that we've taken, is let's get specific and really be constructive on what's needed to unlock more progress.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Leela.
Great. I have a question for both Irina and Kate. Thank you. And my question is about educating the public. And what do you see being done right now to educate the public on these issues? Because I work in the industry and I don't know a lot of the questions that you have been discussing tonight. I don't know the answers to a lot of those questions, and I should be part of the public that's educated on some of these issues. And especially in the next 4 years, what do you see being done to educate the public? And then ideally, what would you see as the ideal state for educating the public?
Would you like to
I
start?
mean, I think so many different layers play a role here, and one of them is all of us. So just for having listened to this conversation, and some of you may have known a lot of the stuff already, but if you didn't, you already know more than most people do. So you now have a role where you can educate others. It's really that broad. We need this kind of discussions to be happening in schools where teachers are now encouraged to use AI. They should be themselves educated about the environmental impact of the tools they're being encouraged to use. We need companies to talk to their own employees, whether they're deploying AI or not. Their employees might be using these tools and they might not understand the impact. Nonprofits, every organization, government units, right? There's so many people. Every time I go around and I start talking, sometimes more coherently than today, about the environmental impact, people are shocked. And so I think for those of us who have been paying attention, it may seem like everybody's talking about it, and if you're trying to read articles about it, you will find them. But at the sort of general level, it's still news to a lot of people, including people who work in the industry. So I think there's a massive gap right now. And where I see it in the next 4 years, I don't know. I mean, I think it depends on whether companies will pick up, the challenge, or whether schools will pick up the challenge, whether lawmakers will pick up the challenge in some way.
Well, I certainly used to think that most of the energy was used in training, and so usage was not a big deal. And so now I've learned here that, like, whoa, my little usage, it's the other way.
It switched a while back, exactly. And most people think it's still about the training, and it's not. There's so many of us using all of this that it's switched.
Just a second
Nina.
question on that is just on the ideal state. Like, I think part of the educating the public is helping the public understand what the vision is. What would a good public format be, or a good public policy be, or training program, if you will, or, across the United States? Would it start with legal laws? Would it, I guess I can take my question during the
Thank you. Let's have Nina. Last question, Nina.
Hi, I'm Nina. Thank you for being here tonight and educating us. I learned so much tonight. So my question is, prior to university, a couple years ago, I worked within grassroots environmental community organizing in the south side of Chicago, where I didn't grow up on the south side of Chicago, but within the south side of Chicago. And so on the south side of Chicago, industries operate completely unregulated within marginalized communities, which causes a lot of pollution as well as learning disabilities for children and health issues, where the EPA would not check on these industries for over 10 years and there would be no regulations. So I was wondering that while we scale AI with these data centers as well as other infrastructure needs, what kind of regulations do you think should be put in place to mitigate the inevitable effects of what could happen to communities that don't have much of a voice against, infrastructure being built where they live?
That is the history of this country and the economy, Kate.
We've looked at this issue as a data company. We've funded through our foundation, through Google.org, something called the Environmental Justice Data Fund, which I think is now somewhere between $10 and $14 million that we've provided in grants to environmental justice organizations that are using the power of data to create more transparency, to do better research. So we've worked with organizations in Cancer Alley, in Louisiana, but also truly across the country. I don't know if we have any projects in the south side of Chicago, but we actually really see data and transparency, as we've been talking about in other contexts this evening, as being really essential to the environmental justice movement. And so that's why we've been providing these grants and continuing to support that work.
One thing I will say is that people within those communities sometimes don't understand some of the impacts themselves. I know there are researchers working on this right now at the UC Berkeley Human Rights Law Center and an organization called Data and Society. They're researching this topic. And partly it's because, again, it's news even to people who live close to data centers that they do and what some of the impacts are. And having some educational, conversations there too, and getting input from those vulnerable communities is really important as well. And it's not happening enough right now. There's also research on the public health implications of all of this stuff, especially the backup generators that sometimes come online so that data centers will keep functioning.
A lot, yeah. No, a lot about these facilities are massive. So Kate and Irina, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. Let's give them a big round of applause for this. This program was supported by Climate One's supporter, Noel Perry and Next 10. I'd like to give a shout out to the Climate One and Commonwealth Club teams for making this happen. That's Adam, Mark, Dan, Megan, Brad, Jenny, Kevin, and Ben. Let's give them a round of applause. I get to sit up here, these fancy people. Subscribe to the pod. We'll come out in a little bit to continue the conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.